Hello everyone. Imagine you are building the ultimate fortress, relying on a single, seemingly indestructible drawbridge for all your daily provisions, only to realize years later that your greatest rival holds the exclusive remote control to that exact bridge. Today, we explore the cartography of coercion, bringing together the colliding insights of Immanuel Kant, Norman Angell, Robert Keohane, Joseph Nye, Thomas Friedman, Edward Luttwak, Henry Farrell, Abraham Newman, Michael Mastanduno, Christopher Clayton, Matteo Maggiore, Jesse Schrager, Matthias Tonik, and Rosa Brooks, unpacking the collapse of the post-Cold War globalization narrative, demonstrating how global economic networks transformed from mechanisms of perpetual peace into structural weapons of great power coercion. The core philosophical paradox we face today is that the very systems designed to unite us have been reverse engineered to control us. In the 1990s, the Western world collectively subscribed to a powerful, almost utopian vision of integration. We fundamentally believed that building a deeply interconnected global economy would render traditional war obsolete. We assumed that if nations traded relentlessly with one another, shared complex supply chains, and relied on the exact same financial infrastructure, the sheer economic costs of entering a conflict would become far too catastrophic for any rational state government to bear. We fail to recognize that integration does not erase harsh power dynamics, it merely centralizes them into hidden nodes of extreme vulnerability. The post-Cold War globalization narrative enthusiastically sold us a vision of decentralized, peaceful exchange. The raw truth, however, is that this pursuit of borderless efficiency quietly forged an entirely new battlefield. Our hyper-connected global networks did not eliminate international friction. Instead, they metamorphosed into the very structural weapons that great powers now actively use to coerce, surveil, and paralyze one another on the world stage. We will trace the journey from the idealistic promises of liberal peace directly to the harsh reality of weaponized interdependence. For decades, the intellectual foundation of our global system rested on a profound optimism regarding the pacifying promise of commerce. The post-Cold War era was built squarely on the illusion that economic interdependence naturally and inevitably suppresses international conflict. If we look back at the timeline of global integration, milestones like the founding of the World Trade Organization in 1995 and China's entry into the global trading system in 2001 were hailed as permanent triumphs of peace. We trusted implicitly in Immanuel Kant's theory of perpetual peace, believing that republics trading together would naturally avoid war to protect their commercial interests. We echoed Norman Angel's great illusion, convincing ourselves that modern conflict had become economically irrational and simply too costly to pursue. We embraced Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye's framework of complex interdependence, operating under the assumption that intricate economic ties would entirely replace pure military statecraft. The underlying logic seemed flawless at the time. As trade volumes and integration reached absolute peak levels, the incentives for military aggression were supposed to plummet to zero. Think about signing a 30-year mortgage with a bitter rival. The assumption is that the shared financial destruction prevents either party from burning the house down. But this assumption completely ignored the strategic realities of statecraft. We built our institutions, our domestic policies, and our economic dependencies on a foundation of wishful thinking, ignoring the fact that economic channels can be violently co opted. Unpacking the collapse of the post Cold War globalization narrative, demonstrating how global economic networks transformed from mechanisms of perpetual peace into structural weapons of great power coercion. We equated rising trade volumes with rising security, fundamentally misunderstanding that vulnerability scales in tandem with integration. This era of peak integration was a quiet incubation period during which the tools of modern coercion were constructed under the guise of open markets. As we peel back the layers of this globalized economy, we discover the terrifying architecture of asymmetry. The relentless pursuit of market efficiency burst a highly concentrated, exceedingly vulnerable supply chain architecture. For decades, multinational corporations prioritized cost reduction above all other considerations. McKinsey data reveals a stark reality where the relentless pursuit of economies of scale structurally eliminated redundancy across the globe, creating massive single points of failure. Imagine a massive metropolis where every single hospital, school, and business relies on exactly one delivery truck for all their daily supplies. The efficiency is brilliant, right? Up until that specific truck breaks down. We designed a global supply chain optimized perfectly for peacetime, completely stripping away the buffers needed for survival during crises. This drive for hyper-efficiency naturally aggregated critical production and logistics into oligopolistic choke points. Instead of a resilient, diverse web of suppliers, the world became heavily reliant on specific geographical nodes for crucial components. Then came the ultimate stress test. The COVID-19 pandemic mercilessly exposed these concentrated efficiency nodes as critical systemic vulnerabilities, paralyzing global logistics almost overnight. Efficiency proved to be the ultimate enemy of resilience. Unpacking the collapse of the post Cold War globalization narrative, demonstrating how global economic networks transformed from mechanisms of perpetual peace into structural weapons of great power coercion. When you concentrate production, logistics, and data in a handful of indispensable hubs, you create a loaded weapon waiting for a powerful state to pick it up. The architecture of asymmetry means whoever controls these oligopolistic choke points holds the power to dictate strict terms to the rest of the world. We sacrifice systemic security on the altar of cost efficiency, unwittingly handing the keys of global coercion to whichever entity governs those critical nodes. This vulnerability is the mathematical outcome of unregulated integration. To comprehend how sovereign states weaponize this asymmetric architecture, we must turn to a brilliant paradigm shift outlined decades ago. Edward Luttwak's 1990s framework correctly predicted that the adversarial logic of military conflict would seamlessly adapt to the global economy. Long before the current era of trade wars and technology bans, Luttwak realized the decline of kinetic warfare did not mean the end of state competition. The zero-sum power dynamics of traditional geopolitics simply mutated into a new arena. In traditional geopolitics, states relied heavily on military firepower to assert dominance over rivals. In the modern realm of geoeconomics, disposable capital operates entirely in lieu of firepower. A nation's financial reserves, sovereign wealth funds, and massive domestic consumer markets are deployed with the exact same strategic intent as physical artillery. Where states once competed furiously through the advancement of military technology, we now witness civilian technological innovation operating in lieu of military advancement. The race for quantum computing and artificial intelligence is a ruthless battle for sovereign supremacy. Furthermore, where traditional empires sought territorial control through forward garrisons and military bases, modern powers utilize deep market penetration in lieu of garrisons. Owning the digital infrastructure or the critical supply lines of another nation grants a level of permanent control that invading armies could only dream of achieving. Unpacking the collapse of the post Cold War globalization narrative, demonstrating how global economic networks transformed from mechanisms of perpetual peace into structural weapons of great power coercion. Latwak recognized the state's fundamental drive to compete is eternal. When the costs of using military force became prohibitively high due to complex interdependence, states simply changed their weaponry. They adopted the grammar of commerce to execute the timeless logic of conflict. Economic policies, investment strategies, and trade regulations are the new arsenals of great power competition. This brings us to a critical dismantling of a deeply entrenched modern myth. Contrary to the boundless optimism of the 1990s, globalization did not create a decentralized, leveled playing field. For years, we were captivated by Thomas Friedman's famous vision of a flat world. The myth of Friedman's flat world suggested a beautifully egalitarian network where nodes of equal power freely traded with one another, seamlessly bypassing traditional hierarchies. It painted a reassuring picture of a democratized global economy where geography and state borders no longer dictated terms, granting everyone equal access to the prosperity of integration. The reality is starkly different and much more dangerous. The true topology of our globalized system is entirely defined by winner take all equilibria. Transaction costs naturally drive unregulated global exchange into highly hierarchical, centralized clusters. Instead of an egalitarian web of equal nodes, the system rapidly organized itself around a handful of global megahubs and regional powerhouses. Consider how a popular ride sharing app entirely dominates a city's transport ecosystem, forcing all drivers and riders to use one central algorithm. On a global scale, massive digital and financial hubs pull in the vast majority of international traffic and wealth, creating peripheral and marginalized actors heavily dependent on the center. Unpacking the collapse of the post Cold War globalization narrative, demonstrating how global economic networks transformed from mechanisms of perpetual peace into structural weapons of great power coercion. Because the Earth is not flat, economic power is drastically concentrated. Fragile and peripheral nodes became inextricably tethered to the center, lacking any viable alternative routes. By refuting the flat Earth theory, we expose the underlying truth of our modern era. Globalization hyper-concentrated power into the hands of whoever controls the mega hubs, turning the architecture of global trade into an asymmetrical battleground where the center dominates the periphery. How extreme is this concentration in practice? The convergence of control is staggering when you look at the raw infrastructure data. Unregulated global exchange naturally aggregates into highly hierarchical networks dominated by a few indispensable hubs. We are not talking about slight market advantages. We are looking at absolute structural dominance over human interaction. Consider the realm of cloud data centers. Amazon Web Services facilities located in Northern Virginia alone process an estimated 70% of global web traffic. An overwhelming majority of the planet's digital thoughts, corporate transactions, and state secrets flow continuously through a tiny geographic footprint in one specific country. Next, consider the physical arteries of the Internet itself. Submarine cable landing sites are the true hard borders of the digital age. 97% of intercontinental internet traffic travels on approximately 300 physical cables, and these vital cables converge at specific, highly vulnerable coastal choke points. Finally, look at global financial messaging. SWIFT processing centers, located in Belgium, serve as the mandatory central clearinghouse for cross border finance. If you want to move money across international borders in the modern banking system, you must pass through this single concentrated gateway. Unpacking the collapse of the post Cold War globalization narrative, demonstrating how global economic networks transformed from mechanisms of perpetual peace into structural weapons of great power coercion. These indispensable hubs are the supreme command centers of the global economy. They were originally built to seamlessly connect the world, but their very indispensability makes them the ultimate points of geopolitical leverage. The convergence of control means that the vast, seemingly chaotic global market is tethered tightly to a handful of physical and digital choke points. Whoever holds the keys to these hubs holds the capacity to instantly paralyze global communications and freeze international commerce. Knowing that these mega hubs exist, we must carefully examine how sovereign powers actively exploit them. This is the precise architecture of coercion. Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman's groundbreaking theory of weaponized interdependence brilliantly articulates this modern dynamic. States with political jurisdiction over central economic hubs possess the absolute structural capacity to weaponize the global network against their adversaries. The process follows a clear, predictable three-step evolution. First, we observe severe network asymmetry. As previously discussed, market efficiency relentlessly drives global trade and data into highly concentrated topological hubs. Second, we introduce the reality of state jurisdiction. A powerful state inevitably possesses geographic or legal authority over these indispensable hubs. The massive data centers, the crucial financial clearing houses, and the foundational intellectual property all exist within the strict legal borders of a sovereign nation. Finally, this culminates in raw coercive authority. The state weaponizes its jurisdiction, intentionally transforming market infrastructure into devastating tools of national security. Weaponized interdependence is fundamentally distinct from traditional bilateral trade sanctions. Traditional sanctions derive their limited power from market size, relying on the simple threat of losing access to a large buyer or seller. Weaponized interdependence derives its overwhelming power from structural placement within the global topography. Unpacking the collapse of the post Cold War globalization narrative, demonstrating how global economic networks transformed from mechanisms of perpetual peace into structural weapons of great power coercion. Farrell and Newman exposed the fatal flaw in the liberal order. Interdependence is a landscape of high mountains and deep valleys. If your nation controls the mountain peak, you easily dictate terms to everyone trapped below. You simply threaten to disconnect the target from the indispensable global network, utilizing the very infrastructure of global capitalism as an instrument of inescapable sovereign dominance. Weaponized interdependence manifests in two distinct and devastating ways across the globe. The first is what we call the Panopticon effect, creating the omniscience of the hub. Powerful states extract unparalleled strategic intelligence by surveilling the information flowing heavily through network hubs under their jurisdiction. Imagine standing in the central sorting room of the global post office, able to quietly read every single piece of mail passing through. This is the reality of modern data control. Take Operation Stellarwind as a prime historical example. The United States National Security Agency leveraged its absolute jurisdiction over US-based internet backbones to extract global communications intelligence on a massive scale. Because so much of the world's data naturally routed through American servers for pure efficiency reasons, the intelligence apparatus cast a net over the globe without ever leaving domestic soil. Similarly, consider the Terrorist Finance Tracking Program, known as TFTP. Following the attacks of September 11, authorities heavily exploited the SWIFT messaging data to map adversary financial networks globally. By tapping directly into the central nervous system of global finance, they achieved total visibility over transnational money flows. Unpacking the collapse of the post Cold War globalization narrative, demonstrating how global economic networks transformed from mechanisms of perpetual peace into structural weapons of great power coercion. The panopticon effect turns the mundane infrastructure of the globalized economy into an all seeing eye. When a state controls a central node, the mere act of observation grants enormous strategic supremacy over rivals and allies alike. The hubs become vast intelligence gathering machines, absorbing economic, political, and social data continuously. This hidden surveillance capability fundamentally shatters the illusion of apolitical commerce, proving that in a highly asymmetric network, privacy and sovereignty are constantly subordinate to the silent power of the hub. The second, more aggressive manifestation of weaponized interdependence is the choke point effect, which dictates the absolute paralysis of the periphery. Privileged states can cripple adversaries by denying them access to the indispensable arteries of global finance and technology, while the panopticon quietly watches the choke point violently strangles. When a state severs a node from the network, the consequences are immediate and catastrophic. We see this vividly in the terrifying realm of financial exclusion. US secondary sanctions possess the power to forcibly disconnect a nation like Iran from the global dollar clearing system and SWIFT messaging entirely. This action paralyzes an entire macroeconomic capacity, isolating the target from the vital lifeblood of international commerce without deploying a single soldier. We also witness this clearly through technological decapitation. Consider the weaponization of the advanced semiconductor supply chain. By denying targeted foreign firms such as ZTE or Huawei access to foundational US patented microchip architecture, the governing state effectively decapitates the target's technological future. Think of a modern smartphone not as a single device, but as a precarious tower of borrowed patents. Pull one central patent out, and the entire product line collapses instantly. Unpacking the collapse of the post Cold War globalization narrative, demonstrating how global economic networks transformed from mechanisms of perpetual peace into structural weapons of great power coercion. The choke point effect proves that interdependence is a terrifying liability if you do not control the central hub. The ability to sever a nation's access to the global nervous system is a power that heavily rivals traditional nuclear deterrence. By weaponizing the choke point, the hegemon forces compliance through the sheer terror of systemic exclusion, ensuring that peripheral actors realize their entire economic existence is contingent upon the goodwill of the state governing the hub. However, possessing a physical network hub is completely insufficient on its own. The physical presence of a hub is useless without the executive machinery, the domestic legal architecture required to force private sector compliance. State capacity and institutional power are the invisible engines driving weaponized interdependence. A state must have the regulatory agencies, the network jurisdiction, and the relentless corporate compliance mechanisms to compel powerful multinational corporations to enforce national security directives. Compare the United States with the European Union. The United States features a highly centralized regulatory apparatus, heavily driven by the US Treasury and the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. This high-capacity system is completely capable of aggressively enforcing extraterritorial secondary sanctions across the global private sector. The US has the legal teeth to make corporations choose between accessing the American financial system or doing business with a sanctioned entity. Conversely, look closely at the European Union. Despite physically hosting critical hubs like SWIFT on its own soil, the EU historically suffers from heavily fragmented capacity. The fragmentation among member state legal frameworks severely limits the EU's capacity for unilateral, unified network weaponization. Unpacking the collapse of the post Cold War globalization narrative, demonstrating how global economic networks transformed from mechanisms of perpetual peace into structural weapons of great power coercion. The translation of economic interdependence into coercive power requires a specialized legal and regulatory transmission belt. Without a robust executive machinery, a hub is merely an inert piece of infrastructure. With it, the hub becomes a weapon of mass economic disruption. This stark contrast in state capacity perfectly explains why certain nations can project geoeconomic power ruthlessly across the globe, while others remain reactive spectators despite holding massive economic assets within their own borders. This brings us to a profound behavioral shift in the dominant power, brilliantly captured by Michael Mastanduno's theory on the calculus of weaponization. The United States historically restrained its network power to maintain liberal hegemony, but escalating geopolitical fear has triggered aggressive weaponization. For decades, the hegemon faced a critical trade off between exploiting its structural power and maintaining the perceived legitimacy of the system it built. Imagine holding a devastating trump card in a high stakes poker game. Playing it too early ruins the game for everyone at the table. During the Cold War, operating in a benign environment characterized by hegemonic commitment, the US utilized the COCOM embargo. This was a highly restrained, modified weaponization deliberately designed to protect long-term legitimacy of the hegemon's global economic order. The US held back from fully weaponizing economic networks to avoid fracturing the alliance. But as the geopolitical climate darkened significantly, the strategic calculus shifted. Today, operating in a highly threatening environment consumed by geopolitical fear, we witness modern maximum pressure. The hegemon now aggressively deploys unilateral secondary sanctions and brutal tech decoupling. This strategy extracts immediate strategic rents, crippling adversaries in the short term, but it heavily risks fracturing the global network altogether. Unpacking the collapse of the post Cold War globalization narrative, demonstrating how global economic networks transformed from mechanisms of perpetual peace into structural weapons of great power coercion. Mastanduno's framework reveals that restraint is an absolute luxury of the secure. When fear escalates, the hegemon abandons the pretense of a neutral, rules based order and immediately reaches for the structural weapons at its disposal. The shift from careful multilateral containment to aggressive unilateral network exclusion marks the definitive, irreversible end of the liberal illusion. What precisely happens when the hegemon abandons restraint? We immediately trigger the spiral of decoupling. Uncoordinated, aggressive geoeconomic coercion forces smaller states to defensively exit networks, completely destroying global trade efficiency in the process. Christopher Clayton, Matteo Maggiore, and Jesse Schrager perfectly diagnosed this catastrophic cycle in 2024, appropriately naming it the fragmentation doom loop. This doom loop operates through a ruthless, inevitable logic. Step 1. The hegemon actively weaponizes a hub, leveraging critical infrastructure for immediate strategic advantage. Step 2. The target state fiercely fears coercion and rent extraction. They clearly perceive their extreme vulnerability and the high risk of economic exploitation at the hands of the hegemon. Step 3. Driven by pure survival instinct, the target initiates costly preemptive decoupling. They take drastic defensive measures to reduce reliance, incurring incredibly high economic costs to build redundant sovereign supply chains from scratch. Think of a crowded theater where someone yells fire. The resulting stampede causes far more damage than the initial spark. Step 4. As multiple nations engage in this frantic defensive retreat, global network efficiency and trade gains degrade rapidly. Systemic fragmentation severely reduces overall prosperity and efficiency for everyone involved. Unpacking the collapse of the post Cold War globalization narrative, demonstrating how global economic networks transformed from mechanisms of perpetual peace into structural weapons of great power coercion. The fragmentation doom loop proves that weaponized interdependence is a deeply unstable equilibrium. Individual state security decisions mathematically trigger collective economic collapse. The very act of weaponizing the network heavily incentivizes the complete dismantling of the network. As trust evaporates entirely, the integrated global economy shatters into paranoid, isolated blocks, guaranteeing the destruction of the market efficiencies that defined the globalization era. In direct response to the hegemon's aggressive weaponization, we are currently witnessing the furious rise of competing hubs. Emerging powers are no longer content to remain highly vulnerable in the periphery. They are actively constructing and leveraging their own centralized networks to challenge the dominant geoeconomic order. This is a deliberate structural challenge to the legacy Western network hubs. Where the transatlantic alliance relied heavily on SWIFT, emerging revisionist hubs are constructing parallel financial clearing networks like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB. To counter the West's historical control over maritime logistics, initiatives like the Belt and Road are aggressively expanding transit and energy choke points across Eurasia. The fierce competition extends deep into the digital and physical infrastructure of tomorrow. Revisionist powers are intensely pushing 5G telecommunications infrastructure, spearheaded by companies like Huawei, to firmly establish a sovereign digital panopticon that rivals Western intelligence capabilities. Simultaneously, they are systematically monopolizing critical mineral supply chains, establishing a brutal stranglehold over the rare earth elements necessary for next generation technology. Unpacking the collapse of the post Cold War globalization narrative, demonstrating how global economic networks transformed from mechanisms of perpetual peace into structural weapons of great power coercion. The creation of these alternative hubs is not driven by an idealistic desire for global integration. It is driven entirely by the absolute imperative of geopolitical survival. Emerging powers clearly recognize that relying on a network controlled by a hostile rival is strategic suicide. Therefore, they are meticulously building parallel ecosystems, aiming to capture their own peripheral actors and establish their own zones of coercive authority. The global economy is violently splitting into competing tectonic plates, each armed with its own arsenal of weaponized infrastructure. This division marks a profound departure from the unified global market we once envisioned, locking the international system into a prolonged state of infrastructural trench warfare, where every new technology standard becomes a contested geopolitical border. This severe fracturing of the global network introduces a terrifying strategic irony known as the paradox of autonomy. Defensive efforts to decouple from a rival actually lower the economic costs of war, inadvertently raising the likelihood of kinetic conflict. Matthias Stonik's 2024 research on the security dilemma of de-risking brilliantly outlines this chilling reality. During the peak of globalization, mutual economic vulnerability served as a massive structural deterrent to war. Because our economies were so deeply intertwined, firing a missile at your neighbor meant immediately devastating your own supply chains and financial markets. But consider what happens when we successfully de-risk. When nations aggressively decouple to protect themselves from weaponized interdependence, they systematically remove the economic brakes that prevent military escalation. If you no longer rely on your adversary for microchips, rare earth metals, or capital, the catastrophic economic penalty for going to war suddenly disappears entirely. Imagine two duelists standing in a room flooded with gasoline. They will never fire their weapons. De-risking is simply pumping the gasoline out of the room, making it perfectly safe to start shooting. Unpacking the collapse of the post-Cold War globalization narrative, demonstrating how global economic networks transformed from mechanisms of perpetual peace into structural weapons of great power coercion. The paradox of autonomy reveals the ultimate tragedy of the geoeconomic era. As the x-axis, representing interdependence and mutual trade costs, moves closer to zero, the y-axis, representing the probability of kinetic conflict, skyrockets. By furiously unwinding the complex web of globalization, we are not securing peace, we are merely clearing the battlefield. The defense mechanisms we deploy against geoeconomic coercion are dismantling the very economic pacifiers that kept the great powers from open confrontation. As the hegemon wildly accelerates its use of these structural weapons, it inevitably encounters the severe friction of coercion. Over-reliance on weaponized interdependence alienates allies and massively accelerates the creation of sanction-proof alternative architectures. Coercion is an inherently destructive tool, and its frequent application generates intense systemic pushback. First, consider the corporate collateral damage. Aggressive choke point deployment causes severe unintended market disruptions. When global networks suddenly exclude a massive integrated firm such as the Russian aluminum giant Rusal, the shockwaves nearly bankrupt intertwined global industries, destroying massive value far beyond the intended target. Second, there is profound allied alienation. Extraterritorial enforcement forces allied nations into compliance against their own sovereign will, generating severe diplomatic pushback. We saw this starkly when European nations furiously resisted US secondary sanctions on Iran, realizing their own economic sovereignty was being hijacked by the hegemon's executive machinery. Finally, the friction of coercion drives shadow network creation. Every single application of a choke point heavily incentivizes the periphery to build a permanent bypass. Accelerated Russian and Chinese efforts to construct non-dollar payment systems seek to permanently insulate them from platforms like SWIFT. If you constantly use a master key to lock your neighbors out of their own homes, they will eventually build new doors. Unpacking the collapse of the post-Cold War globalization narrative, demonstrating how global economic networks transformed from mechanisms of perpetual peace into structural weapons of great power coercion. The friction of coercion means that weaponized interdependence is a rapidly decaying asset. The more aggressively a hub is weaponized, the faster alternative architectures are founded and built. The short-term strategic rents extracted by the hegemon are ultimately paid for by the permanent destruction of the very network monopoly that granted them power. We have reached the ultimate conclusion of our journey. The geoeconomic century has firmly arrived, and the era of frictionless, apolitical globalization is permanently dead. Corporate and state actors must now permanently adapt to a landscape of continuous structural economic warfare. Let us review the profound transition we have witnessed today. In the past, under the idealistic banner of liberal peace, we maintained an artificial, optimistic separation of commerce and national security. We fundamentally believed trade was an insulated zone of mutual benefit. Then came the harsh transition phase, marked by the realization of asymmetry. We suddenly understood the terrifying reality of structural network power and the inherent fragility of physical supply chains. Now, we face the green future, pure geoeconomics. This is entirely defined by the total weaponization of interdependence. Geopolitical risk is no longer a minor external factor for businesses to loosely consider. It is the absolute central determinant of sovereign and corporate survival. Unpacking the collapse of the post Cold War globalization narrative, we have undeniably demonstrated how global economic networks transformed from mechanisms of perpetual peace into structural weapons of great power coercion. As Rosa Brooks hauntingly observed, globalization created a world in which everything became war. The battle lines of the 21st century are not drawn in the sand. They are drawn across server farms, financial clearinghouses, and semiconductor supply chains. Now, as we collide this theoretical framework with the dawn of the AI era, the stakes multiply exponentially. The competition for artificial intelligence supremacy will not be fought with traditional armies, but through the absolute weaponization of compute power, data jurisdiction, and algorithmic control. We must navigate this treacherous new cartography with our eyes wide open. That concludes our exploration for today. Thank you for your time, and see you next time.